Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm David Elwood, Dean of the School, and it's my great pleasure to see you here tonight for the 2006 Malcolm H. Weiner Lecture. And let me say a word or two about the lecture, the overall lecture itself, and then introduce our very esteemed speaker. This series began as a result of a generous gift of Malcolm Weiner in 1989. Malcolm Weiner is someone I've personally had the opportunity to work with in many different occasions on many different settings. He is a man of all seasons. He provided support for Poverty Chair, of which I sat in. But much of his own work has been in interest in scholarship and on international financial matters, including currency relationships and the international monetary system. And as a result, Mr. Weiner, who's a class of 1975 graduate and a Harvard Law School alumni, endowed this lecture to bring together extraordinary people to talk about critical issues of the time. Malcolm Weiner has served in many different capacities here. He's also created the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, again, a center that deals with issues involving social policy, larger kinds of questions, and indeed, in his own life, he worked on training programs for inner city students. So this, however, represents, again, his work, his consideration, his interest in one other element of his life, the financial side. And we've had many distinguished lecturers in this series. Unfortunately, Malcolm Weiner is unable to be with us here tonight, so in his absence, nonetheless, I want to honor him. Other previous Weiner lecture series have included Helmut Kohl, Jim Schlesinger, Václav Klaus, Sir Leon Britton, and Pete Peterson. So tonight, it's my very great honor to introduce Pascal Lamy, who will certainly add to the luster of this already illustrious group. Now, part of the reason he'll add to the luster is that he's actually a French Legion of Honor winner, which is, I think, perhaps the first of members of this group, maybe not, who have that. Even more importantly, he is a marathon runner and will be running in the New York City Marathon coming up. However, these are not the primary reasons he is here to speak. Indeed, he's the 5th Director General of the World Trade Organization. And his appointment took effect on September 1st, 2005 for a 4-year term. This, of course, means that he was elected. This is a very elaborate process of selection. And he was elected with the support of the entire organization, which is very unusual for someone from the European Union or whatever. And he was elected with the I think, quite significant support of the United States as well. So this is actually clearly a remarkable human being, if nothing else, and a testament that people can work together even across the Atlantic. Previously, he was the Trade Commissioner of the European Union in Brussels from 1999 to 2004. From 1994 until 1999, he served as Director General of the team responsible for restructuring Credit Lyonnais. After that, Mr. Lamy was appointed in July of 1999 to the European Commission, and he started as in the civil service with the French Finance Ministry, the Inspector General of Finance, and the Treasury Department. He later became advisor of economics and finance minister to Prime Minister Pierre Mauroy, and from 1984 to 1994, he worked as the chief of staff to the Commission President Jacques Delors. He's a member of the French Socialist Party, also politically active in the Mouvement European. I mentioned already he's a French Legion of Honor winner and has received other international orders of merit. He is the kind of civil servant that I think many of us aspire to be, and I think we all benefit from their activities. He's also in the kind of job that requires a remarkable capacity to bring together diverse interests for the greater good. And this is certainly a time when we need to think about these. The WTO talks are in suspension right now, and so one of the important questions is how we move forward from here, and the person to talk about this will be General Lamy. Let me add one other note. We recognize that issues around the World Trade Organization generally have aroused a lot of interest and sometimes anxiety and views. This is an opportunity for us to hear first and then to ask questions and certainly we welcome challenging questions. But I ask that all of you, during his talk, allow him to speak, and then those of you that have ideas and insights you'd like to share, the question and answer time will follow. So with that, let me welcome General Amin.
Well, thank you, Dean, for this introduction. And I think if we're looking for a precise definition of globalization, you've just given one. A French social democrat working for open trade and being elected with the support of the US. I think that's probably one of the best definitions I ever heard, and I thank you for that. More seriously, let me say how happy I am to be with you today in this first trip to Boston as WTO DG to share with you some thoughts on global governance and the contribution that the World Trade Organization can make. And what better place to do that than here at the Kennedy School of Government in this Malcolm Winner lecture. As the Dean just said, Malcolm Winner, the author of numerous works on the ancient Mediterranean and Egyptian world, but also of more recent realities such as the transformation of the Soviet Union or the US economy, is indeed a good source of inspiration for tonight's discussion. How globalization obliges us to look at new forms of addressing global challenges beyond the traditional nation-state system. Starting with globalization, it has enabled individuals, corporations, nation-states to influence actions and events around the world faster, cheaper, and deeper than ever before, and equally to derive benefits from them. It has the potential for expanding freedom, democracy, innovation, social and cultural exchanges without imbalancing outstanding opportunities for dialogue and understanding. But of course, the global nature of an increasing number of worrisome phenomena, scarcity of energy resources, deterioration of the environment, natural disasters, spread of pandemics, growing interdependence of economies and financial markets, and the migratory movements provoked by insecurity, poverty, or political instability are also a product of globalization. And at the same time, there is a widening gap between these global challenges and the traditional ways of working out solutions, our traditional institutions. Globalization is at the same time a reality and an ongoing process that cannot be met by traditional nation-states alone. We therefore need to contemplate new forms of governance at the global level. Now, what do I mean by governance? And what's the difference between governance and government? The term governance was first used in the 12th century in France, where it was a technical term designating the administration of bailliage or bailiwicks. As with the word government, it comes from the Latin word for rudder, conveying the idea of steering. From France, it's crossed the Channel, and in England came to designate the method of organizing feudal power. Underlying feudal power were adjacent suzerainties, among which there had to be coherence. There was no central power as such, but a body, primus inter pares, whose purpose was to settle dispute peacefully and see that any conflicting interests were reconciled by consultation with those involved. Governance thus focused on uniqueness, unity of interest. And if we liken the international society to a medieval society in its lack of any organized central power, then it needs governance. In other words, a concept that affords a basis for the organization of power or the elements of consultation and dialogue necessary to securing greater harmony. Coincidentally, this concept of governance disappeared in the 16th century with the emergence of the state, because the two notions, governance and government, are profoundly different. Governance, in a way, removes the political dimension from government. The latter belongs to Westphalia nation-states and their particular modes of government, legitimacy and representativeness. Governance is a decision-making process that through consultation, through dialogue, through exchange and mutual respect, seeks to ensure coexistence and in some cases coherence between different and sometimes diverging point of view. This involves seeking some common ground and extending it to the point where joint action can be envisaged.
The WTO means death to farmers. The WTO means death to fisher folk. The WTO...
You're welcome to ask a question, but if you can't be quiet, we're going to have to ask to be removed.
They are polluting the earth. They are limiting access to health care, especially AIDS drugs, which patents must not be allowed for.
We will.
AIDS drugs are a human right for everyone.
Let's discuss this later on. So, globalization reveals a new sphere of common interests that transcends states, cultures, and national histories, and my view is that we need to go beyond the classical inter-nation systems. And indeed, the disproportion between the enforcement role of states and their actual capacity to handle issues calls for new forms of governance. But, of course, global governance has its own specific challenges. As with any system of power within a nation-state, what's needed is not only governance, but good global governance. That is a system that offers a good balance between efficiency and legitimacy, adapted to this new universal concept. What then are the specific challenges of global governance as opposed to the classical systems of national governance? In my view, elements of legitimacy must be based on institutions and procedures. Classical legitimacy entails citizens choosing their representatives collectively by voting for them. But it also relies on the capacity of the system to bring forward public discourse and proposals that produce coherent majorities and provide citizens with a feeling that they can debate the issues. In other words, the political system must represent the society and allow it to see itself as a whole, with all its members using the same grammar and experiencing the same feelings. Since legitimacy depends on the closeness of the relationship between the individual and the decision-making process, the first challenge of global governance is distance. The other legitimacy challenge refers to the so-called democratic deficit or the accountability deficit, which arise when there are no means for individuals to challenge international decision-making. And although transparency remains crucial to ensure that governments are both accountable and challengeable at home, classical definitions of domestic accountability and democracy cannot apply simply transposed into international institutions. We have to explore
Again, I'd like to ask that you wait and ask a question, and otherwise enjoy the nice cooler weather outside.
So we are right into the topic on the specific challenge of legitimacy in global governance. That is therefore to deal with the perceived, too distant, and non-accountable and non-directly challengeable decision-making at the international level. The second element in the validation of power is efficiency. Citizens expect the governments to be able to identify the problems and expect results from institutions with political responsibilities. But quantifying efficiency in concrete terms is not easy when power is remote and when there are multiple levels of government. The task becomes even more complicated. So the first efficiency challenge of any global governance stems from the fact that the classical Westphalian order is based on the full sovereignty monopoly of nation states. And we must find ways to address the opposition from sovereign nation states who resist, more or less intensely, depending on the state or the subject matter, transferring or sharing with international institutions their jurisdiction over certain matters. The second specific challenge of global governance as compared to well-known nation-state system is that the lack of coherence between international institutions. Even when
WTO policies destroy the lives, livelihoods, ecosystems, and communities of billions of people around the world.
So it would be a great question. And so, again, we will let our speaker ask. And
so, back to these specific challenges. Even when traditional state power is partly transferred to international institutions, it's handed only to very specialized international institutions whose mandates are limited and whose direction or instructions come solely from nation-state authorities. And as the saying goes, coherence begins at home. It lies first and foremost with the states, but we all know that the states are not that coherent and do not act that coherently. So how can the actions of their institutions be coherent? So the overall specific efficiency challenge of global governance is to deal with partial and incoherent efficiency. Handling global problems in relying on classical models of domestic democracy has then important limitations. And yet, we need to ensure feelings of legitimacy and efficiency. Otherwise, citizens will lose their trust in their local or national government if transnational issues that affect them daily cannot be adequately dealt with. So there is a continuum between the credibility of domestic democracies, which in my view is at risk if global governance does not find its own democratic credentials. Now, let's try and identify a few pragmatic steps towards elements of global governance, knowing that the nation-state traditional benchmark is not that great. Growing interdependence and global governance involve the recognition of the role and responsibilities of new actors, of openness of proceedings, of authentic and effective participation, and of accountability of those acting, and finally, coherence. Now, how can these various objectives, how can this independent interdependence be better managed? I will take 4 elements which in my view should guide us: values, actors, fora, and surveillance. First of all, values. Values allow our feeling of belonging to a world community, embryonic as it may be, to coexist alongside national specificities. We must identify common values alongside common interests. Actors. We need actors who have sufficient legitimacy to get public opinion interested in these debates and who are capable of taking responsibility for its outcome and who are held accountable. Fora. We need fora for discussions and negotiations with the necessary transparency. And finally, we need monitoring, surveillance and enforcement of states' actions performed in a legitimate manner. Now, I'm not proposing any institutional revolution, but rather a combination of global ambition and pragmatic suggestions. Building global governance is a gradual process involving changes to long-standing practices, entrenched interests, cultural habits, and social norms and values. Now, where is the WTO in all this? Where does the WTO feature in this landscape and in this process? The main mission, the core business of WTO, is to open markets and regulate world trade for the benefit of all people. To perform our task, we use 4 channels. First, we offer a forum where our members negotiate international agreements which are then adopted. Second, we have monitoring and surveillance mechanisms, including peer reviews of members' actions. Third, we have a strong mechanism of adjudication and enforcement of members' obligation. And finally, we have a mandate to ensure coherence with some other international organizations, not all other, but some other. Now, let's assess rapidly the WTO's operations against these 4 elements of governance I just mentioned. Starting with values, the basic value underpinning the WTO is that market opening is good. The multilateral trading system helps to increase economic efficiency, and it can also help to reduce corruption or bad government. At the same time, the WTO also recognizes the importance of values other than market opening and trade efficiency. First, in its preamble, the WTO agreement recognizes sustainable development as one of its objectives, and this calls for the consideration of fundamental values other than those of market opening, to include, for instance, the protection of the environment, development, as well as some social values. WTO members have the right to deviate from market opening obligations in favor of values of public morals, the protection of health of the people, animals, or the conservation of natural resources. Moreover, pursuant to the Charter of WTO, each member is free to determine the values to which it gives priority and the level of protection it deems adequate for such values. Concerning the actors, the WTO is a classical international organization where the governments are members. Only governments are members. Many argue that the WTO has a problem of accountability. Now, accountability with our members is high. The old club of the GATT has now given way to new groupings of states and coalitions within the WTO, a new G6, Australia, Brazil, EU, India, Japan, US, has replaced the old Quad, Canada, EU, Japan, US. The proposals of what we call the G20, an alliance of developing countries on agriculture, are now the benchmark in many of the areas of the ongoing negotiations. There are also other important actors, such as the G33 group of developing countries or the African group of nations. Of course, we also have a green room, which sometimes is seen as a sort of non-transparent system, and those who attack such green room meetings probably ignore the fact that with around 150 members today, the 150th is coming at the end of this year with Vietnam, decisions to be taken by the entire membership need to be prepared in smaller formats, like committees in a parliament. Consensus among the members for the adoption of decisions remains the rule and ensures legitimacy. Vis-à-vis non-state actors, however, the situation is more problematic. Indeed, we have no mandate from our members to enlarge the WTO family beyond governmental representation. Yet, we've made efforts within the current system. We now have public annual fora open to all participants, states, non-states. Regular WTO briefings are held for NGOs and parliamentarians. Members of civil society can send amicus curiae to brief to the WTO adjudicating bodies during dispute settlement procedures. And just this year, for the first time, some hearings in this judicial process have been open to the public. Regarding the WTO as a locus for discussion, I think it's pretty clear that we provide a permanent forum for negotiations among members concerning their multilateral trade relations. This sort of global governance requires intense discussions and negotiations, and from that perspective, the institutional structure of the WTO is well developed and rather sophisticated. We have various levels and forms of decision-making that can be both multi-stage and sequential. All in all, it for sure ensures that issues brought to the WTO table by the members cannot simply be swept away. And finally, on the WTO monitoring, surveillance and enforcement mechanisms, there are...
I want to ask a question. Why are they taking
you will have...
You glorify feudalism. People are supposed to be...
You can ask a question after it's over, but please, I'm sorry.
Feudalism is.
Please wait.
You've expanded slavery around this world. There's more slavery right now than under feudalism.
I was asked to leave, no provocation. I was already asked to leave. I haven't even said anything.
As long as you don't, you can stay. You can ask.
We had a bit of time for questions. Let's try and keep it. Finally, on this monitoring surveillance, my point is that the WTO system and the WTO trade policy review enables regular collective evaluation and appreciation of our members' trade policies and practices. So we can, and we do, through transparency and understanding of our members' trade policies, review constantly to improve this adherence by rules, disciplines, and commitments. And by the way, the ongoing negotiations will reinforce this surveillance in an area which is bilateral trade agreements. We also probably will soon host a surveillance forum on aid for trade provided bilaterally, regionally, or multilaterally. And finally, in the WTO, the non-observance of the rules, and that's a distinctive feature of WTO as compared to other international institutions, may give rise to litigation, and the litigants are bound to accept the decision of panels or of the appellate body. Otherwise, sanctions can be imposed. For many critics, the existence of sanctions allows trade to take precedence over other sectors of international governance, including health, the environment, or fundamental and human and social rights. And there are critics in this direction. Now, let's look at the facts. The experience of 10 years of dispute settlement shows that, on the contrary, the WTO has been sensitive to maintaining this balance between trade and non-trade values. Is the WTO a perfect model? No, of course. But it is a laboratory for harnessing this globalization and contributing to the construction of a system of more global governance. A place where evolving global governance can find some roots in ensuring legitimate decision-making, as well as an institution that can also evolve in providing for the increasing participation of non-traditional international and domestic actors. It is a forum where values can be discussed, and this is crucial as trade restrictions in the future will become more and more value-based. So given its economic and political dimensions, the WTO can be one of these players in this necessary building of a system of global governance. And let me conclude in saying that I very much hope that all WTO members consider the contribution that the WTO can make to ensuring that globalization works more to the benefit of one and all peoples as they reflect on the resumption of the negotiations under the Doha Development Agenda. Thank you for your attention.
Now it is time for questions, and so there are microphones here, up here, right over here, and over here. And let me just say a couple things. The best questions have three characteristics. Four characteristics actually. One, you start by just, saying who you are. Second of all, you keep it short. Third, there is one, and fourth, it ends with a question mark. So with that, let me start right here.
Hi, my name is Charles Esguino. I'm an MBA MPA candidate here at Harvard. And my question is to do with the leadership of the WTO. The last time I checked, none of the senior leadership had ever had any business experience, yet many of the policies that the WTO seeks to push through are ones which benefit businesses around the world. So my question is, would the WTO benefit from a greater injection of people with significant private sector experience in its leadership?
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends a lot on what you call leadership. WTO is a member-driven organization. Nation states make the decisions, and nation states choose their representatives in this negotiating fora according to their own institutional rules. The people who negotiate and make the decisions are representatives of countries, ministers that are empowered by their political system to contract or decontract and negotiate. And it's up to them to decide how much of the source of business interest they want to put into the machine. Most of national systems do that quite efficiently. You know, business usually has its own channel to ministers, and they usually make sure that their own interest is channeled through the process. Now, if the leadership is the DG, which it is not, it may be a bit of a leadership. This time, the WTO DG has quite a bit of business experience. Thank you.
Right up here.
My name is Nicholas Kukrik. I'm a second-year student, Master in Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. And first, thank you very much for coming. I wanted to ask a slightly technical question, but to start, just simply, what do you think is the single most important element in the talks today that could restart them? And would you agree with commentators who often argue that it's mostly about developed countries giving major concessions in agriculture to restart them even before getting concessions in terms of non-agricultural market access?
Yes. The stumbling block of this negotiation for the moment is agriculture. I'm not sure it's a purely North-South issue. It's both a North-South issue and a South-South issue, and a North-North issue. The three big players, US, EU, India, I'm not mentioning Brazil because Brazil is extremely helpful in this negotiation. The three big players haven't yet found the sort of right balance between the two elements of the mandate of the negotiation, which is reduction in trade distorting subsidies and increase in market access. And the balance between these three animals, with US with high subsidies and low tariffs, EU with high subsidies and high tariffs, India with high tariffs and low subsidies, is not that easy to find. This is where the negotiation got bogged down in July. which is why I had to suspend them, sort of this coffee break, which we are in for the moment. It can only resume if the sort of positions which they had in July change. Now, this change can only happen with several ingredients. First, a lot of political pressure for resumption. It's now there, and notably developing countries have been the ones who've been the most vocal for resumption because they consider that the option of failure of this round is for them a catastrophe. So political pressure, a lot of domestic heavy lifting, because trade negotiators, as usual, have to spend 2/3 of their time negotiating with their domestic constituencies and 1/3 with their colleagues around the table. And obviously on agriculture, we are in this 2/3 part of the process. And this 2/3 part of the process is a prerequisite for moving to the last third part of the process. And third, quite a lot of technical sounding tests so that they can come back to the table with simultaneous expression of flexibilities. I mean, there's no way they'll come back to the table saying, guys, you got it right, I was wrong in July, and I'll start and saying, well, I'm ready to pay more and get less. This won't happen. It has to be engineered in a way that a compromise based on new flexibilities is there. If this was to happen, I wish it will, I'm not sure it will. If this was to happen, then the rest of the negotiation would probably unlock rather rapidly. I mean, things like industrial tariffs or services or anti-dumping rules or fishery subsidies or, I mean, all these other elements of this 20 topics agenda are in better political shape than agriculture. So agriculture remains the stumbling block. It is the sort of totem of this negotiation. And true, if you look at the balance of our rules in WTO, as we have inherited them from 50 years of negotiations, there remains a bias against developing countries in the rules we have on agriculture. We need to change this. That's what developing countries have asked for, a bit in a sort of similar vein as they did it for textiles and clothing in the previous round. They want this to be rebalanced, and they will not accept a conclusion where this is not rebalanced. So that's the overall frame. Now, further than that is going into numbers, proportions, and that's where the negotiation still needs to take place.
Right up here.
Hi, my name is Samir, and I'm a first-year MPP student at the Kennedy School. My question to you, sir, is that is there a moral or an ethical argument to be made against tariffs and trade restrictions put in place by the leader of free trade? I'm thinking of the U.S., when they slap tariffs on foreign imports from developing countries. Can we make a moral or like an argument based on justice, global justice?
That's a good question. I think in the WTO, as a sort of world organization, we can have many debates on whether protection of industry or agriculture through tariff or subsidies is good or bad. Our overall consensus is that trade opening is good, protectionism is not good, hence the virtue of reducing tariffs and subsidies that distort trade. Not all subsidies. We, in agriculture, for instance, have a classification where a large part of subsidies are determined by agreement of our members on our criteria as being non-trade distortive. But there remains a debate whether, for instance, on agriculture, what economists call externalities justify or not a specific protection in a market-organized system. So that debate is there. What for sure is a moral obligation is to make sure that when you have a system of rules that encompasses all the actors, these rules are fair. And my view is that for historical reasons, which have to do with the way international division of labor was framed under previous ages, and notably during colonialism, there remains unfairnesses in the system. And these unfairnesses, just by coincidence, again, are on things like textiles or clothing or agriculture, where developing countries have a better comparative advantage than developed countries. And this is not just coincidence. It's the legacy of historical, economic, and political forces. And we have to rebalance this in order to make sure that a number of developing countries can sort of trade their way out of poverty, as previously happened for others. So, yes, there is, in my view, a sort of moral obligation of more fairness in the system.
Right here.
My name is Kai Monheim. I'm a student in the second year of the MPP program here. You've described that the trade talks are in a coffee break, that national representatives are under the pressure of their own constituencies back home. Given this background, do you think that the instruments the WTO as an organization has to facilitate trade talks are efficient enough today? And could you suggest maybe improvements for those instruments? Thank you.
Well, yes, the question of the governance of the institution or the organization and of the negotiating process is there now. And it's been there for a long time, and it's been debated regularly. My predecessor commissioned an excellent study, which is now on the table, on how could we improve our organization, our proceedings in various directions, including more transparency. So we will have to do our sort of spring cleaning at some stage, but this is not the root of the present difficulties. The present difficulties have to do with good old, extremely well-known, perfectly identified and investigated constituency, vested interest, problems of relationship with the politics. The reason why the negotiation deadlocked on agriculture has nothing to do with WTO processes, unless somebody believes that some sort of a majority vote could oblige US Congress to slash trade distorting US subsidies, could oblige the Indian Parliament to open its wheat or rice market, or to oblige a majority of the Council of Ministers in the European Union to slash by 80% tariffs on poultry or beef. This will not happen. It has to happen through consensus. It has to happen through a negotiated outcome, and again, where the thing deadlocked was not because of procedure. It's because the main actors, as refined by the process of the negotiation on the main issues, could not find a political agreement. So it has to do with politics and not with organization. If and when we succeed in concluding this round, the question of what next? Should we structure the next layer of rules will be on the table, and then, the idea box will be open, and I look forward to that.
Right here.
In a world where the wealth of the global North and South were biased and are currently, yes, I'm asking one, and are currently shaped by imperialism, doesn't the World Trade Organization's stance of free trade between two parties who are imbalanced in power by, as you say, colonialism and imperialism, reinforcing imperialism? When you talk about fairness, fairness to whom? When you have two parties with an imbalance of power between them, isn't allowing for negotiations that are unmoderated or free? Or when you talk about countries trading their way out, surely you understand that the parties that have power will act in their own interests, and for the WTO to take a hands-off stance would be a perpetuation of that power imbalance and of that imperialism. My view is that it does, and that this talk is a farce, meant to inculcate us into thinking that there is some accountability. But I ask you, accountability to whom? And if it is accountability to the people of the world, how is the WTO serving that accountability by allowing for this imbalance to be not just perpetuated, but to grow? Thank you.
As I said, I believe there remain imbalances in our system of rules, and they have to be addressed. And the only way they can be addressed is through negotiation. Now, there are, in my view, less imbalances than there used to be. The power game around the WTO table has changed. 20 years ago, EU-US were calling the shots. This is not true today. India, China, Brazil are also calling the shots. So the power of the system has changed, the topography of power has changed, and developing countries have more and more of a weight and of a say. But that's what they want. That's what they advocate around the WTO table. It's developing countries who made sure 20 years ago that agriculture would be within the rules of WTO. They asked for that. It's developing countries who 20 years ago asked for the end of the multi-fiber agreement, where a specific corset was put on trade on textiles and clothing in the favor of developing countries. They got these two things in the other way around. Of course, for the price of that, the US and Europe got an agreement in the trade parts of intellectual property protection, because it is a deal and it is a trade-off. And this time, we have the occasion of moving one more step in this direction. And this is what developing countries are asking for. Now, at the end of the day, among my 150 members end of this year, more than 2/3 are developing countries. So there's no way there will be a consensus on the result of a negotiation that these 2/3 of developing countries would not agree to. So it's with them. Now, as I said, my accountability as WTO DG is with my members. This is our rule. This is the international system we live in. Same for the boss of the World Health Organization, same for the boss, quote unquote, of the International Labour Organization. We are constituency member state driven. It's not enough. We are sort of approximating other channels of legitimacy, notably with civil society, as we do it with business or trade unions. But this is not formal, because it doesn't stick with the principle of the Westphalian order. So if the question is, should this 1648 concept be updated, my answer to that is yes. And the more of us will be pushing for that, the better it will be.
Thank you. Right up here.
Thank you. My name is George Moose, and for a while I was the head of the U.S. permanent mission to the UN in Geneva. I stress the UN, not the WTO in Geneva. And I want to thank you first for coming. My question has already been answered in part, but I wanted to perhaps ask it in a slightly different way. You gave a speech 2 nights ago at the New York University Law School. And in that speech, you said a couple of things which I'm sure my former colleagues down in Washington regarded as fairly provocative. You said, first and foremost, that political decolonization ended 50 years ago, but that we had not yet completed the process of economic decolonization. And then you went on to call for moving beyond the so-called Washington Consensus and adopting something you described as the Geneva Consensus. And I wondered if you would, for this audience here, elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that.
Of course, in my position, I have to remain neutral, which doesn't mean totally castrated. I see a slight difference between being neutral and not speaking, for instance, because part of my capacity of interaction with the system also depends on the ability of players to utilize me in various directions. Now, if I say that economic colonialism is coming 50 years later than political economic decolonization comes 50 years later than political decolonization, I believe it's a fair reflection of the realities of this world. And it's an interesting issue when you try and analyze the system to make it work better, to recognize that political decolonization was easier than economic decolonization. Now, may be a bit provocative because of this allusion to something which is divinized in many public opinions, which is colonialism, but I think it's historically true. I mean, I haven't written all these books on how the United Kingdom or Britain at the time was handling its trade relationships with India, for instance, or how France at the time was running its international division of labor with Northern Africa. So I think it's a fact of history. Now, moving from the Washington Consensus to the Geneva Consensus has nothing to do with being unnice to Washington, which is one of my big members. I look at what my colleagues in the World Bank or the IMF have changed their mind on a number of these issues. And roughly speaking, and probably too roughly speaking for a public occasion, but let's take this risk, Washington Consensus could be characterized as you liberalize and God will take care of the rest. The Geneva Consensus is a bit more sophisticated. It starts with the fact that trade opening is good, but that it only translates into welfare creation and poverty reduction if a number of other conditions are met, which belong to this side of life, not the future one, this one. And I believe in sort of trying to explain this difference between the Washington Consensus and the Geneva Consensus that we have in WTO to focus more attention on why is it that developing countries do not always benefit from the theoretical benefits of trade opening, which we should bring them. If a Rwandan farmer who has an excellent comparative advantage in farming cut flowers cannot export in the European Union or in Japan or in the US, where the market is open, zero tariff, zero quantitative restrictions, because he or she cannot match the maximum pesticide residue standard, which Japan, EU, or US will control at the border, we've not done our job. We've done our job in zeroing tariffs or quantitative restrictions, but there is another barrier, and this needs to be addressed. Non-tariff barriers need to be addressed. It's not rocket science. Measuring maximum pesticide residue is a technology which is extremely cheap and widely available, but the international system, because Rwanda is too poor to afford the $5 billion which it would cost to its whole farming system to be able to do that, the international system must step in. So that's the difference between the Washington Consensus, maybe I caricature it a bit, and the Geneva Consensus, which is a bit beyond what we traditionally used to do, a bit beyond the sort of part of WTO activities which we devote to training, for instance, developing countries, negotiators.
Thank you.
Right up here.
Hi. Good evening. My name is Isa Lejarraga. I'm a second-year student from Panama. I was interested in hearing your views on the current thrust to bilateralism and regionalism. Do you feel these are harmful deviations from the WTO efforts, or do you perceive them as constructive intermediary steps towards the closure of a multilateral agreement?
Well, depends. There are situations where multilateral trade opening, rules-based, and bilateral trade opening, which, by the way, is usually not that rules-based, can be synergetic. There are circumstances in which bilateral trade deals can be a poison for the system. And to answer this quite complex question rapidly, if bilateral is a complement to multilateral, it can have extremely positive impacts. If it is seen, managed as a substitute, then we will run into trouble. And what we have to keep is this primacy of multilateral rules over bilateral rules, with the necessary hierarchy and the necessary capacity to enforce this hierarchy through the surveillance and verification that bilateral trade deals do not harm the multilateral system. Now, this is the theory of WTO. The reality is that the members of WTO are not that keen for police to have a serious look at this compatibility, and we will have to do in the future a better job. But it is not the easy way out. Systemic issues, like the ones we just mentioned, trade distorting agricultural subsidies, for instance, are not dealt with by bilateral deals. They are carefully kept aside. Systemic issues like new disciplines on anti-dumping procedures are kept aside. So a number of systemic issues cannot be coped with by bilateral trade agreements. And again, just by coincidence, this is where developing countries are asking for changes in the system. So bilateral, in a way, is a way of escaping this sort of balance of forces which we have around the multilateral system and making sure that developing countries have less of a say. And it's obvious that when an average 20 million developing country negotiates a free trade agreement with big US, big China, big India, or big Europe, the balance of forces will be totally different from the one we have around the WTO table. So for all these reasons, especially in these times of difficulties for the negotiation, I would like to make sure that bilateral deals are not the easy way out.
I'm afraid we only have time for two more questions. They'll be right here and right here. Go ahead.
My name is Mohammed. I'm a second-year student. My question has to do with the obligation of reciprocity in trade agreements. Now,
with what? Sorry,
the reciprocity in bilateral trade agreements? The reciprocity, sorry. Now, what I have in mind is the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries who have been enjoying for the last 30 years or so access to their main trading partners, most notably the EU perhaps, but now, because of WTO regulations, non-reciprocal agreements are no longer allowed. And we are scrambling right now to come up with something that would look like a reciprocal agreement between ACP countries and the EU and others by mid-2007, which is in 7 months, and the agreements look extremely weak and absolutely not in favor of ACP countries, largely because of the time constraint, which does help the negotiation be easier. Now, my question is, why don't we simply consider extending this possibility to allow non-reciprocal entry? I mean, it's a marginal share of the world trade anyway. So, thank you.
No, it's a very good question, which in my neutral position I should immediately post to another address, which is other than ACP developing countries. What has changed is not the rules. We have the same rules since 50 years on trade preferences. They are possible, which is why the ACP group enjoyed trade preferences in the European Union, or the Caribbean or African countries enjoyed preferences in the US, with one condition, which is that they are agreed by the membership, that this specific preference, as an exception to the MFN clause, is waived. What has changed is not this rule. It's been there and it's there. What has changed is that other developing countries have signaled that they would not agree to new waivers. They believe that this system creates for ACP countries a preferential system, which is true, which harms their own comparative advantage. That's why the only way out, in absence of these waivers, the only way out is to go the route of classical free trade agreements, or looking like free trade agreements, with the principle of reciprocity. Now, this principle of reciprocity is one ingredient of a dish, which can be accommodated with many, many, many other ingredients. It has to be there. But, and I have to be careful because I'm not speaking at all for the Europeans in this matter, nor for the Africans, but there can be a way, with the formidably flexible system we have, of transforming these preferences into Canada Dry reciprocity agreements, which in fact will be extremely long in time and maybe not cover 100% of trade. After all, we have a rule in WTO that says that to be compliant, free trade agreements have to cover substantially all trade. Now, what does substantially all trade mean? Maybe substantially all trade, if the question is what's the value of this reciprocity, can be interpreted in a very extended way. So that's the situation. In my view, it's a road, and I cannot prejudge of any decision by the membership, but I know for sure that waivers are not there anymore, and that it is possible that another route will lead to a result which won't be that different, but which will match the rules which we have and which we cannot change without consensus among our members.
This will be the last question.
Thank you. My name is Mahari. I'm Mason Fellow here at Kennedy School of Government. My question will again take you to accountability issue. You mentioned that, for example, you being appointed as a director, being supported by the US, is a surprise. Again, you said Washington is a big power in WTO. And I would ask you the question that whether you're accountable, really accountable to this status, like Orwell has said. You know, all states are equal, but some are more than equal. Whether you are following that and accepting that, or whether you are accountable to Ethiopian farmers who are fighting Starbucks, or you are accountable to Starbucks rather. The second question I have is, you say WTO is in legitimacy crisis now. And taking you to your own personal belief, leave it your position now for the time being, and tell me which oppositions are the opposition made against WTO, which ones are the ones you think legitimate and morally acceptable. And I see that as you seem to me that no one is very comfortable with the legacy that has happened in this world, but you seem to be a little bit comfortable with the change that are being made now, which are very, very sluggish. And farmers in Africa and elsewhere are dying because of this.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last sentence.
Well, basically, I'm asking you.
What's the last sentence about Africa?
Farmers are victims of forces that has been using WTO as their legitimacy.
First, on the accountability issue, you're absolutely right. All members are equal, but some are more equal than others. And I have a duty in trying to rebalance in the system the inequalities that stems from differences of size, wealth, and power. And I've always said that's what I would try to do, including in the sort of policy brief which I gave before the members when I was pitching for this job. Whether I should have done that or not is another question, but I'm committed to that. So within the small margins which I have to sort of influence the process with my own ideas, I try to do that. And you know, the jury is with developing countries. I mean, they ask them whether they believe I'm doing this as I said I should do it and I would do it or not. That's the sort of best jury. But ask them, ask the members. Ask India, ask China, ask South Africa, ask Senegal, ask Cambodia, and so on. On the critics and the problem of legitimacy, I have my own critique of the system. I'm not sort of obedient servant of the system we live in. I have my own ideas. I'm not in a position where I express them before a mandated constituency like I would have done it as an EU commissioner or as a French minister. I have a very heterogeneous membership, but I have my own critics. And I have a habit of trying to check from time to time, which is basically every day, whether what I believe and what I do are sort of reasonably connected. But I'm running a public good, factoring in these critics, and there are in my view, extremely valid critiques, is something that can only be done through a process, again with the necessary procedures and transparency, including in sort of making sure that we connect with critics which our members who drive the organizations do not always repercutate fully. But I have a limit to that, which is what my members will let me do in terms of interaction with civil society. Some of my members are not that keen that civil society steps in. Take the problems of publicity of hearings and the dispute process in the dispute settlement. Some of my members, usually developing countries, do not agree that NGOs should step in. I have my own limits. And finally, on the questions of farmers in Africa, I think we should discuss that bilaterally. I would like to see in which African countries has a negotiation in WTO led to a reduction in bound tariffs, which is what we negotiate in WTO, which is the maximum tariff that has been harmful to the life of African farmers. That's the real question. Now, what the applied rate of country A or B in Africa or in Asia is not something which this country has negotiated in WTO. It's a tariff which this country believes is the proper one for running imports, the internal market, consumers and farmers. But looking, and please have a look at that if you're not convinced, if you have a specific case in kind, look at what the obligation vis-à-vis WTO of this African country is, and I would be surprised if a low tariffs, which has led to difficulties for a farmer, is of the remit of the WTO system and not of a decision which is taken autonomously by the government of this country. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Director General, for taking this time off from your coffee break to be with us here and sharing your very interesting and provocative ideas of a member-driven organization. So thank you all. Safe trip home. Thank you very much.